Picture this: the crowded heart of Rome, 67 AD. Senators in their white togas, merchants hawking wares, children weaving through the forum's marble colonnades. And then, silence falls. All eyes fix on the emperor himself, Nero, striding proudly as if the entire city were his stage. But it isn't Nero alone that steals the breath of onlookers. At his side walks a young figure adorned in silk and jewels, shimmering like a goddess descended into mortal form. Whispers ripple through the crowd. They call her Empress, but those who know the truth choke on disbelief. That radiant woman had once been a boy named Sporus. What the Romans saw that day wasn't merely scandal. It was a grotesque theater of power, a love story twisted into cruelty. Nero, still haunted by the death of his wife Poppaea, had found a way to bring her back, or at least force the illusion upon the empire. It wasn't the first time Rome had been shocked by excess, but this act cut deeper because it revealed something chilling. The emperor's grief had curdled into madness, and his obsession now had a human vessel. Sporus, still a teenager, would be forced to play the role of a dead woman, his own identity smothered beneath the emperor's fantasy. What we are about to uncover isn't just a footnote in history. It is a story of survival within the jaws of power, where a boy became an empress, and an empire became complicit in one man's delusion. Before Nero became a monster in the eyes of history, he was a boy king who seemed destined for greatness. At just 16 years old, when the laurel crown was placed on his head, Rome held its breath with cautious hope. Here was a fresh face, unscarred by the cynicism of politics, untouched by the cruelties that had corroded so many emperors before him. At first, he did not disappoint. Nero reduced oppressive taxes, easing the burdens of farmers and merchants. He funded lavish public games, filling the arenas with spectacles that thrilled the common people. More surprisingly, he revealed a softer side, writing poetry, strumming the lyre, even performing on stage before an astonished audience. The aristocrats muttered that such antics were beneath an emperor, but the crowds adored him. In their eyes, Rome had not just a ruler, but an artist, a man of the people. For a brief, glittering moment, it seemed possible that Nero's reign might usher in a golden age. Yet even then, cracks were forming. Power, especially the kind that places 60 million souls under your command, is a dangerous burden for anyone, let alone a teenager. Absolute authority meant no voice could correct him, no advisor could restrain him. And, as the years passed, isolation seeped in like poison. By 65 AD, the promise of that bright beginning had withered. Paranoia clouded Nero's judgment, vanity consumed his decisions, and the boy who once charmed the people was slowly transforming into something darker. Into this fragile balance stepped a woman who would ignite both Nero's passion and his downfall, Poppaea Sabina. She was no ordinary beauty. Ancient writers describe her as dazzling beyond measure, her skin pale as ivory, her hair glimmering like gold under the Mediterranean sun. But her allure was more than skin deep. Poppaea possessed a sharp mind, a calculating intelligence, and an ambition that matched Nero's hunger for grandeur. At the time, Nero was bound in a cold political marriage to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor. Octavia was dutiful, quiet, and unremarkable in the glittering theater of the imperial court. Poppaea was her opposite, vivacious, commanding, reveling in the spotlight of Roman high society. To Nero, weary of restraint, she appeared not just desirable, but essential, the embodiment of everything he craved. What began as an affair quickly spiraled beyond mere scandal. Rome was no stranger to adulterous emperors, but Nero's attachment to Poppaea was something different. It was obsession. He showered her with gifts that drained the treasury, pearls from the Indian Ocean, silks from China, perfumes carried across deserts from Arabia. He stationed guards around her, not to protect but to possess, ensuring no other man's gaze lingered too long. Poppaea understood the peril and the power of her position. She was no passive mistress. She was a strategist, shaping her future with every glance and every whispered word. In Nero, she found not just a lover, but a throne waiting to be claimed. Rome had seen scandals before, emperors with mistresses, senators ruined by affairs. But what unfolded between Nero and Poppaea was something far more dangerous. At first, it was whispered gossip in the corridors of the Palatine, but soon The empire realized this was no fleeting passion. Nero was consumed. He could not bear the thought of sharing her, even with memory itself. Ancient historians describe how he watched her with a feverish vigilance, as though every glance from another man was a threat to his very existence. His mood swung like a pendulum, lavishing her with affection one moment, raging with jealousy the next. He placed guards at her side, men whose real duty was not to shield her from danger, but to monitor her every word, every smile, every fleeting look. The gifts grew more extravagant. Gold and jewels, yes, but also monuments and portraits, dozens of likenesses carved in marble so that Poppaea's image would never leave his sight. In Nero's chambers, she was everywhere, her painted eyes staring back at him even in solitude. Then came the decisive break with tradition. Nero cast aside Octavia, his lawful wife and a symbol of dynastic stability, to marry Poppaea. The wedding was not merely opulent. It was a declaration that his will stood above Rome's expectations, above politics, above the gods themselves. The people murmured. The Senate bristled, but Nero was deaf to all voices but hers. What had begun as an affair had grown into a fever. This was not love as mortals knew it, but possession, a hunger that would consume them both. Poppaea was not a mere ornament to Nero's reign. She was intelligent enough to know that her beauty, combined with Nero's obsession, gave her influence that few women in Roman history had ever held. In the shadowed corridors of the palace, she whispered names for appointments, urged alliances, and shaped policy through suggestion more than decree. Entire families rose or fell depending on her favor. To many, she became as dangerous as Nero himself. But power of this kind is a double-edged sword. While other courtiers lived in fear of Nero's sudden rages, Poppaea dared to confront him. She mocked his vanity, questioned his decisions, and even ridiculed his artistic performances when they fell short of his grand ambitions. In a court where everyone else tiptoed on broken glass, she stood her ground. That defiance was intoxicating to Nero, but it was also perilous. Poppaea was bold enough to challenge the emperor, yet shrewd enough to know her position was never secure. She used her influence to protect her family, weaving a net of loyal allies within the Senate and court officials, as if preparing for the day Nero's obsession cooled. It was a dangerous game, to keep him enthralled while ensuring she had defenses if his love turned to wrath. Still, for a time, she seemed untouchable. The empress of Nero's dreams and nightmares, the only person in Rome who could defy him and survive. But her boldness would prove her greatest weakness. The moment that shattered everything came in the year 65 AD. Historians differ on the details, but the outlines are clear enough to chill the blood. Nero returned home after a long day, some say from chariot races, others from rehearsing his beloved stage performances, and found Poppaea waiting. She was pregnant then, carrying what might have been the emperor's heir, a child who could have secured her position forever. But Poppaea was not in the mood for indulgence. She confronted him, accusing him of caring more for his vanity than for his duties as husband, father, and emperor. Tacitus claims her words pierced him with sharp clarity, that his obsession with art and image had eclipsed his responsibilities to Rome itself. It was a rebuke Nero could not endure. The argument spiraled, voices rose, footsteps echoed across marble, the tense silence of servants holding their breath. And then, in a fit of blind rage, Nero struck her. Some sources say a single brutal kick to her abdomen. Others insist it was a flurry of blows, his fury unleashed without thought. What all accounts agree upon is the outcome. Poppaea collapsed, bleeding, broken, and fatally wounded. By the time Nero realized what he had done, it was too late. The woman he had worshipped, adorned, and imprisoned within his obsession, lay dying before him, her unborn child lost with her. In that instant, the Emperor of Rome became the murderer of his own love. What followed was not grief, as mortals know it, but the unraveling of an emperor's mind. When Poppaea died, Nero's world collapsed into delusion. Ancient writers tell us he fell upon her body, sobbing, pleading, ordering her to live as if his imperial command could reverse death. Physicians were summoned at once, bribed with riches, threatened with torture, but none could undo what he had done. According to Roman custom, a body was to be burned quickly, purified by fire. Nero refused. He had her embalmed instead, sealed in alabaster and laid within a tomb more lavish than that of many emperors. And, as if even that could not contain his obsession, he declared her divine. A cult was established in her honor, temples erected, sacrifices demanded. Senators and servants alike were forced to praise her in the present tense, to act as if she still walked among them. At banquets, her couch was left empty but adorned, as though she might at any moment recline there again. This was not devotion. It was a kingdom trapped in the madness of one man's mourning. Rome, the greatest empire on earth, bowed its head not to gods or law, but to the fantasy of an emperor who could not let go. And into this dangerous fiction, into this theater of grief, a young boy named Sporus was about to be drawn, unaware that his life would soon be stolen and rewritten. It was during these shadowed days of mourning that Nero's gaze fell upon a boy who would become the vessel of his obsession. His name was Sporus. Barely 14 or 15, he had grown up within the palace walls, born into slavery but later freed, a status that carried both privilege and peril. Freedmen in the imperial household could rise to remarkable influence, sometimes outshining senators, but their entire existence rested on the fragile favor of the emperor. One misstep, one shift of fortune, and they could be discarded, punished, or killed without recourse. Sporus was not remarkable for political skill or military prowess. What made him unforgettable was his face. Ancient writers describe a striking resemblance between the boy and the late Poppaea Sabina. The same delicate bone structure, the same luminous eyes, features so eerily alike that courtiers whispered of divine echoes, as if the dead empress's spirit had returned in male form. In an age when Romans often believed physical likeness revealed hidden spiritual bonds, this resemblance was no trivial detail. When Nero looked upon Sporus, he did not see a boy. He saw resurrection. He saw the chance to undo the irreversible crime that haunted him. The emperor, once a grieving husband, now became a creator of grotesque illusions. And for Sporus, what might have been an unremarkable life of service suddenly became a nightmare stage on which he would be forced to perform a role he never chose. When Nero first beheld Sporus, the resemblance to Poppaea struck him like a revelation. Here, in this fragile boy, he saw not only a reminder of the woman he had destroyed, but an opportunity to reverse fate itself. In Nero's mind, Sporus was not Sporus. He was Poppaea reborn. The emperor's grief, already poisoned by madness, twisted into something more grotesque. If the gods would not restore his wife, then he would take the role of the gods upon himself. Of course, there was one obvious obstacle. Sporus was male. But to Nero, a man who believed himself divine, gender was not a barrier. He had ordered armies across continents, commanded senators to live or die with a word. What was a boy's body compared to his will? In his delusion, it was a small problem with a brutal solution, and so Nero resolved to remake Sporus into the image of his dead wife. Not as a masquerade, not as a game, but as a permanent transformation. Physicians were summoned, their orders undeniable. This would not be a simple disguise. It would be a surgery, an act of mutilation designed to erase Sporus's identity and force him into the mold of Poppaea. What began as grief had now become a calculated cruelty. The emperor of Rome would not mourn as others mourn. He would build a living doll, a puppet empress fashioned from pain, and command the empire to accept the illusion as truth. The chambers of the imperial palace became the site of one of the most harrowing ordeals ever recorded. Nero's physicians, bound by fear as much as duty, prepared to carry out his command. Surgery in the ancient world was a brutal affair. There were no sterile instruments, no anesthesia beyond crude opiates or wine. Infection lurked in every wound. Yet Sporus, still a boy, was forced onto the table, held down by guards while the physicians advanced with iron knives. The procedure was castration, a mutilation meant not to heal, but to erase. It was not medicine. It was the destruction of a human identity. The pain would have been excruciating, searing through flesh and bone, each moment stretching into an eternity. The screams of the boy echoed in halls where marble statues of gods stood indifferent, silent witnesses to a crime of power. Survival itself was uncertain. Many who endured such operations died within days from fever or blood loss. But Sporus lived. When he awoke, his body was forever changed. He would never be able to father children, never again be counted among Roman men. Society, obsessed with lineage and masculinity, would see him as something in between, stripped of both honor and future. But Nero did not see a broken boy. He saw progress. To him, Sporus was clay taking shape, the living replica of Poppaea he demanded. The emperor had torn away the boy's humanity in order to create an empress, and the nightmare had only just begun. Once Sporus's body had healed, the second stage of his transformation began. Nero was not content with surgery alone. He wanted a living portrait of Poppaea, remade in flesh. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, after the dead empress. From that moment on, the boy's former identity was erased. The palace seamstresses crafted wardrobes of silken gowns that clung and concealed, designed to flatter his altered form and blur what traces of masculinity remained. Jewelers were ordered to rework treasures that had once adorned Poppaea herself, necklaces of pearls, rings set with emeralds, ornaments heavy with meaning. To wear them was not luxury, but a shackle, binding Sporus to a ghost. Every day became a lesson in erasure. Cosmetics masters taught him how to soften his features with powders, how to redden his lips with crushed pigments, how to darken his eyes with kohl until they matched Poppaea's remembered gaze. Hairdressers shaped his locks into elaborate styles, curling and twisting for hours under the hiss of heated irons. Even the way he walked, sat, and spoke was drilled into him. Tutors corrected his posture, forced grace into his gestures, trained his voice to rise in tone and cadence until every word sounded feminine. This was not mere play acting. It was psychological torture, the slow destruction of self. Each mirror showed him a stranger. Each gesture reminded him of the life stolen. In the emperor's eyes, he was becoming Poppaea. In Sporus's own, he was vanishing. By spring of 67 AD, Nero's grotesque fantasy reached its climax. He announced that Rome would witness a wedding, an imperial marriage so grand it would rival the gods. Courtiers whispered in disbelief, but none dared object. The bride was Sporus, dressed in silks that shimmered like moonlight, veiled and adorned with Poppaea's own jewels. To Nero, it was not a boy he led to the altar, but his resurrected wife. The palace hall was transformed into a theater of splendor. Imported flowers perfumed the air, oil lamps flickered against gilded walls, and musicians filled the space with hymns of union. Guests, senators, generals, foreign dignitaries, played their roles flawlessly, offering congratulations while masking their unease. They had no choice. In this twisted performance, disbelief could be fatal. The rituals followed Roman tradition, vows exchanged, hands joined, bread broken. Every gesture was meant to signal legitimacy, and so, before the most powerful men of the empire, Sporus was declared Empress of Rome. Outwardly, it was a marriage. In truth, it was the final act of a boy's obliteration. To the watching world, it was both horrifying and mesmerizing. The emperor had married not a woman, but an illusion of his own making, sculpted from grief and cruelty. And all of Rome, from its senators to its slaves, was forced to bear witness. After the wedding, Nero treated Sporus not as a companion, but as if Poppaea herself had risen from the grave. The boy was granted his own staff, luxurious chambers, a litter for travel, and all the trappings of an empress. To outsiders, it looked like privilege, but behind the gilded walls, it was a prison made of silk and gold. Every day became a performance. Sporus sat beside Nero at state banquets, smiled on command, and played the dutiful wife in every public appearance. When Nero reminisced about moments with Poppaea, memories that Sporus had never lived, he was expected to nod, to respond as if they were his own. One slip, one hesitation could mean death. The boy's survival depended on becoming the ghost Nero demanded, blurring the line between performance and annihilation. Servants whispered of the emperor spending hours simply gazing at Sporus, addressing him as Poppaea, speaking to him as though the past were alive again. For Nero, it was not a masquerade, but reality. For Sporus, it was a nightmare in which he ceased to exist. The jewels he wore were not ornaments, but chains. The gowns, the cosmetics, the carefully arranged hair, all reminders that his own body, his own name, his own self had been stripped away. He was not Sporus anymore. He was a doll, a reflection, a shadow cast by a woman who no longer lived, and Rome, in silent complicity, accepted the illusion. In 66 AD, Nero's obsession with his own artistry carried him across the sea to Greece. He fancied himself a poet, a singer, a champion of the games, and he longed for the applause of a culture he revered as the cradle of art. Rome could grumble at its emperor on stage, but Greece, Nero believed, would recognize his genius. And so, in a grand procession, he sailed east, bringing with him his court, his entourage, and, of course, his empress. Imagine the bewilderment of Greek aristocrats as the Emperor of Rome arrived not only with musicians and actors, but with a teenage boy dressed in silks, veiled and adorned, seated in state, as if he were truly Poppaea. Sabina returned from death. Introduced to foreign dignitaries as the Empress of Rome, Sporus was forced to play his part with flawless devotion. The Greeks, accustomed to strange Roman excess, could only watch in silence. Some surely whispered in private, others smiled tightly in public, but none dared openly question the fiction. To do so would have been to insult not just Nero, but the empire itself. In city after city, Sporus was paraded as a symbol of Nero's love and divine authority. But for the boy himself, each appearance was another act in a cruel theater, another day erasing the faint embers of who he once had been. What began in the shadows of Rome was now displayed to the wider world, and the nightmare had no borders. But even an emperor cannot hold back the tide of history. By 68 AD, Nero's extravagance, neglect, and cruelty had pushed the empire to the brink. Rebellions flared in distant provinces, governors defied his commands, and the Senate's patience snapped. The Praetorian Guard, once his shield, turned their loyalty to his enemies. For the first time, Nero felt the chill of isolation not in the privacy of his palace, but in the very fabric of Rome itself. Panic seized him. He fled the capital with a handful of loyalists, Sporus among them, clutching not soldiers or treasure, but the fragile illusion he refused to release. Together, they slipped through back roads to a villa outside the city, waiting for rescue that never came. Nero oscillated wildly between fantasies and despair. One moment he dreamed of fleeing to the east and reclaiming power with loyal legions. The next he rehearsed his own death, practicing speeches, even asking companions to guide his hand in suicide. The boy Empress Sporus watched as the most powerful man in the world unraveled before his eyes. At last, when word arrived that soldiers were closing in, Nero chose death over capture. With trembling hands, he pressed a dagger to his throat and, with help, drove it home. The emperor who had reshaped the world to his madness was gone. But for Sporus, the nightmare was far from over. When Nero's body fell, the empire did not pause to mourn. Rome, weary of his madness, exhaled with something like relief. But in the shadows of that collapse stood Sporus, more exposed than ever. For years he had been the centerpiece of Nero's delusion, paraded before courtiers and foreign rulers as the Empress of Rome. With Nero gone, he was no longer protected by imperial power, but neither was he free. He was a living reminder of everything obscene about the fallen emperor's reign. Powerful men recognized both his danger and his value. In the chaos that followed, Sporus became a prize passed from one claimant to the throne to another. Otho, who once had ties to Poppaea before Nero, claimed him first, then Vitellius, seizing his rival's spoils, took him as well. Each treated him not as a human being, but as a relic of Nero's court, keeping the illusion alive by calling him Sabina and forcing him to live as a woman. The boy, who had already been robbed of his body, his name, and his freedom, was now stripped of the last fragile hope of safety. With every shift of power, he became a pawn in larger games, his survival dependent on the whims of men who saw him only as a symbol, never as himself. For Sporus, the fall of Nero did not mean deliverance. It meant the continuation of his torment. Only now, without even the twisted protection of the emperor who had created his nightmare. Vitellius, the new master of Rome, was a man of appetite and spectacle. To him, Sporus was more than a curiosity. He was an opportunity to amuse the masses, to flaunt the humiliation of Nero's ghost before the eyes of thousands. The emperor devised a cruel plan. Sporus would be paraded into the Colosseum, not as an empress, but as a character in a grotesque parody of myth. Ancient sources suggest he was to play the role of Persephone, the maiden dragged into the underworld, forced into public violation as the crowd roared approval. For Rome, it would be entertainment. For Vitellius, it was power. And for Sporus, it was the final stripping away of dignity, the last stage of degradation after years of being molded, mutilated, and paraded. The boy who had once walked the marble halls of the Palatine beside an emperor now faced the prospect of being a spectacle of suffering, his torment no longer hidden in private chambers, but exposed before the cheers of an empire. But Sporus had endured too much to allow this final cruelty. Rather than step into the arena as Rome's plaything, he chose the one act that was still his alone to make. He would not be paraded. He would not be mocked. He would not be dragged into the underworld alive. Faced with the horror of Vitellius's plan, Sporus made the only choice that was truly his own. He ended his life, most likely by poison, sometime in 69 AD. He was barely 20 years old. For a boy who had been stripped of body, name, and identity, death became the final act of defiance, the last shred of agency denied to him in life. In refusing to be paraded through the Colosseum, he reclaimed a fragment of dignity that the empire had long since stolen. Yet the tragedy of Sporus is not simply that he died young, but that he was never allowed to live as himself. From the moment Nero saw his face, he ceased to exist in the eyes of power. He became a vessel for obsession, a ghostly replica of Poppaea, an illusion forced upon him until the very end. Ancient writers remembered him less as a person than as a symbol of Rome's decadence, proof of Nero's madness. But behind those accounts lies the haunting truth of a human life erased. We will never know Sporus's hopes, his dreams, or the person he might have become if fate had spared him Nero's gaze. What remains is the echo of his suffering and the flicker of his final defiance. His story is not just about cruelty, it is about the resilience of a soul that, even when broken, chose its own end rather than submit to further humiliation. 2,000 years later, his name lingers as a reminder. Empires may rise and fall, but the cost of unchecked power is always paid in human lives.